whenever anyone goes missing, the intriguing thing is, where are they? And is it possible to find them? And then you do need the people closest to the case to provide some information, to provide a springboard for you to use your skills. So I was approached by a very, very homely, very caring police officer, and I think he'd got my name from the National Crime Faculty, as it was then, or something, and realized that I probably could help with finding Sarah. And also, once there are two aspects, you see. First of all, can I help to find Sarah? I might be able to do that because I have been able to help the police find bodies, and I haven't even left my study. I can point them in directions and give them ideas. The other thing is, if they do find a suspect, can we implicate that suspect with where Sarah was found and with other places that are relevant? Then you start asking for all the appropriate things that might form those links. So there's the early stage where it's very much, can we use any basic information to make predictions? And then when they've got a suspect, then all the guns come out and you say, right, well, have you got anything at all that would link this person with this child and or with the places he's been with this child, where he's taken this child? But the most important thing is to find that little girl and to link anyone that might have been with her. So where she was taken from is desperately important, because whatever happens, one has to eliminate that place, all the trace evidence from that place, from everything, because it could get mixed up with other trace evidence. So you have to have a very good picture of that place in scientific terms, so that you can eliminate it from any other picture that might come along. So I went there and I took samples of the field entrance, where the people would automatically go into the field, all along the hedge, where the children had obviously made, or someone had made a sort of pathway along the hedge by running up and down. Then where the children were playing under the tree. On reflection, it probably wasn't at all relevant in a way, because the whiting hadn't been to that tree. He'd been watching them over the hedge. But the hedge itself was important, and I'm glad that I actually knew this. I did a species survey of the whole area, so I had lists and lists of plants in different spots, different places, so I could then say, well, this assemblage, that represents that bit, and that represents that bit, so that when I did get his red sweatshirt, I could recognize the hedge on it. Several days later, the sandal turned up. I can't remember the actual timeline now, but we were working, first of all, I worked with the archaeologists, and I went to the mortuary, worked on Sarah's body. I got a good profile of what she'd contacted, where she'd been. She hadn't been anywhere else other than, she hadn't been laying down anywhere else or buried anywhere else and dug up or anything like that. It was just that one place. She'd been killed. That's where she lay. That's an important thing, because sometimes villains, murderers move bodies, you see. Well, no, this was her primary resting place. We established that. And then I had I took a lot of preparation. There's a lot of chemistry in the laboratory, and a lot of samples from the grave site, from the grave itself, because don't forget, not only would he have the top of the grave on him, he would have the inside of the grave on him. And the trace evidence inside a grave is different from the trace evidence on the surface. So I had to have a whole profile ready of pictures, if you like, evidence, pictures built up from the scientific evidence that I had worked on. The most important items with Whiting's clothing. That told it all for me, yes. If you can imagine the beginning of a huge high-profile case like this, there's so much going on, and they're being battered with information right, left and centre. It's not easy. People were putting floral tributes all the way along the verge, but of course it was going along the verge, along the hedge, and it virtually got to the point where the grave was, just through the hedge, which is a bit sad. But as it happened, it didn't make that much difference, and the parents were allowed to lay a floral tribute not far from the grave. Well, now, of course, that is very frowned on because you're contaminating the crime scene. Don't forget, everybody who contributes to a case is only given fragments of it. So I'm looking at it in a very fragmented way. Most people would be looking at it in a fragmented way, except for the main police officer in charge, who's got everything at his fingertips, and he decides who's going to do what. But that's what it seems like to me. And I came to that conclusion long after the case. It was only when I got the locations that were given to me afterwards, I could see that. And I think he was doing reconnaissance at Chiltington Golf Course, and it wasn't suitable, and off he went somewhere else, well, to the field. And don't forget, he may not have even been on the same day. His red sweatshirt, when I got it, it had masses of holes cut in it. Well, that's because the geologist had got it first and had cut all these little holes out because he thought he could see soil on it. He came up with a conclusion that that soil did not relate to Sarah's grave. When I analysed that sweatshirt and I did the front, the back, the sleeves, everything, it did match the scene, very much so. Not just the grave, but on the way to the grave, because there was a huge bank of stinging nettles, and he was covered in stinging nettle, and I think he was carrying Sarah, fell over, and because there was a lot of stinging nettle on him. And don't forget that, well, you probably don't know, the stinging nettle doesn't produce very much pollen. You have to have male plants anyway. They're male and females, and these were male plants, and I think he fell into them because Sarah, bless her, she had stinging nettle all over her as well. And there was this huge bank of stinging nettles. And when you came to the end of the stinging nettles, that's where the grave was, just at the end of the stinging nettles. And so, but not only that, I could see quite clearly that the profile from that sweatshirt was similar to the meadow where the little girl had been buried. Yes, the soil you could see didn't match the crime scene. Why? When I say crime scene, I mean the grave site. That's because Whiting was digging out the foundations of a garage near to where Sarah was found. Now, foundations go deep into the ground, and it's not likely that there would have been any pollen or any really meaningful trace evidence in it. And indeed, the geologist was right. That soil did not match the grave site. But what happened was the pollen from the gravesite was superimposed on it. So I got the superimposition picture, all the pollen that was on top of the sweatshirt after he'd finished. And there's no doubt about it, it matched the crime scene. The gravesite was a very specific habitat. It was a meadow full of typical meadow pasture. I could tell from the profile it was pasture, and the hedge was very ancient. It's along Stane Street, the Roman road. Very, very ancient hedge, very, very characteristic. And it was such a clear picture of that place on Whiting. And it isn't just pollen; it's plant spores, fern spores, fungal spores, all sorts of microscopic bits and pieces. It's all trace evidence, and they are proxy indicators of that place. They relate to that place. They come from that place, and they tell a story about that place. And I can't talk about it, but my evidence was utterly distressing, and the police felt that if my evidence were brought in court, Whiting wouldn't get a fair trial. So the fact that they got the shoe with the fibre and the hair was like manna from heaven, because they did get enough evidence to link Sarah with the van. and with the van with Sarah, because I think her hair was found in it, and fibres from a curtain that was in the van were on the shoe, and that really was a godsend, because that could put him away. If they hadn't had that sandal, and my evidence, I'm pretty sure, would have put him in prison. Losing that little girl ruined that family's life. The brothers, the sisters, the mother. They were all devastated. And don't forget, they had the eyes of the world on them. They were under a microscope. It must have been very, very hard for them. Hoping that she'd be found, and then she was found, and then it was all horrible. They had to go through the trial. And then to think that you have men like this roaming around. And he had past history of bad behavior of different sorts, if you could call it that. And yes, I mean, I think Sarah's mother had a campaign, didn't she? Sarah's Law and so on. And there would have been vigilantes out to get him. It was a very, very difficult time, because nobody likes paedophiles. An awful lot of people are paedophiles. I think it's a bit sad that there are so few people that have the opportunity to learn my subject in the way that I learned it, because the universities have changed so much in the last 20, 30 years, and policing has changed, and the emphasis in forensics has changed. A lot of it now is IT and DNA. There is still a role for old-fashioned trace evidence.